By the time the hearing adjourned that afternoon, Speaker Mike Johnson would have done something unprecedented in congressional history. He would have admitted to a lie so large it had no defense. $1.2 billion. That was the number Jasmine Crockett had been waiting to say out loud. The number Johnson had buried in 3 separate budgets, moved through shell allocations, and sworn under oath did not exist. She had the receipts, all of them. What made him finally say it? You're going to want to hear this. The hearing room that morning felt like every other oversight session Johnson had dominated for the past 18 months. He entered with the assured stride of someone who had never lost a procedural battle, the kind of confidence that comes from controlling the floor, the calendar, and the committees. His opening remarks were delivered without notes, spoken directly to the cameras positioned at the back of the room. He acknowledged Congresswoman Crockett with a practiced smile and what could only be described as institutional condescension. She sat at the far end of the table, young, female, black, a freshman representative from Texas asking questions about budget reconciliation. Johnson had handled 100 of these before. He thanked her for her interest in fiscal responsibility, complimented her passion for transparency, and suggested that perhaps once she had spent more time studying the appropriations process, the numbers would make more sense to her. The dismissal was gentle, almost paternal. That was the mistake. Johnson's prepared testimony lasted 11 minutes. He spoke about continuing resolutions, baseline adjustments, and the structural complexity of reconciling omnibus packages with discretionary caps. The language was designed to obscure rather than clarify. He cited the Congressional Budget Office. He referenced reconciliation rule interpretations from parliamentarians no longer in office. He framed the budget not as a document of choices, but as a matrix of inherited constraints and unavoidable obligations. There were no villains in his version of events, just math, difficult, regrettable, unavoidable math. He finished by reminding the committee that every allocation in question had been reviewed, approved, and signed into law through proper legislative channels. The subtext was clear. If Congresswoman Crockett had concerns, she should perhaps direct them toward her own party's failure to propose viable alternatives during the markup process. He sat back. His chief of staff, seated behind him, appeared to nod slightly. Crockett took notes throughout. She had not interrupted once. When her turn came, her tone was almost conversational. She thanked the speaker for his testimony and acknowledged the complexity he had described. She agreed that reconciliation was difficult and that baseline scoring created genuine challenges for appropriators working under tight timelines. For a moment, it seemed she might be conceding the point. Then she opened the first folder. It sat on the table in front of her with 3 additional folders stacked beside it, their tabs visible and labeled in handwriting clear enough to read on camera. She removed a single-page document. It was a summary sheet from the Office of Management and Budget dated 14 months earlier. She read the top line aloud. Discretionary allocation for Department of Homeland Security Infrastructure Modernization, $412 million. Authorized but not obligated in the prior fiscal year. She asked Johnson if he recalled that allocation. He said he did. She asked if the funds had been obligated in the current fiscal year. He paused before answering. He said the allocation had been restructured to align with updated security assessments and that the funds were no longer itemized under that specific heading. She nodded slowly and placed the document face up on the table. Then she opened the second folder. This folder was thicker. It contained 12 pages of line item transfers pulled from 3 separate continuing resolutions. Each page had sections highlighted in yellow. She did not read them all. She summarized. The $412 million allocated for DHS infrastructure had been moved in stages. First to a general operations account, then subdivided across regional field offices, then transferred again into a non-itemized contingency reserve. The money had not been spent on infrastructure. It had been moved until it became difficult to track. She asked Johnson if that was accurate. He said the transfers were standard practice and that contingency reserves existed precisely to provide flexibility when appropriations encountered implementation delays. She asked what implementation delays. He said he would need to review the specific operational reports from the field offices in question. She told him she had already done that. She opened the third folder. It contained the operational reports he had referenced. Not one of them mentioned infrastructure projects. Not one requested funding reallocations. Not one cited implementation delays. The field offices had never been consulted. The transfers had been executed by the Speaker's office directly. Johnson's face had changed slightly. The assured expression was still there, but the muscles around his jaw had tightened. He said oversight of contingency transfers was within the constitutional authority of the Speaker's office, and that he resented any implication of impropriety. Crockett did not respond to the accusation. She simply moved to the fourth folder. The fourth folder was the largest. It was a 3-ring binder, thick enough to rest unevenly on the table when she placed it down. She did not open it immediately. She let it sit there. She told Johnson she wanted to be very clear about what she was about to present because once this information entered the congressional record, it could not be retracted. She asked if he wanted to clarify his earlier testimony about the contingency reserve before she continued. He told her to proceed. She opened the binder to a tabbed section marked with a red flag. It was a spreadsheet compiled from FOIA-requested Treasury disbursement logs cross-referenced with OMB obligation reports. The spreadsheet showed that the DHS allocation was not the only fund that had been transferred into non-itemized contingency reserves. There were 47 separate allocations, spanning 19 months, totaling $1.2 billion. Every one of them had been moved out of its original authorization. Every one of them had been reclassified as operational contingency, and every one of them had been transferred by authorization, signed personally by Speaker Mike Johnson. She read the total aloud, $1.2 billion. Then she asked him a question so simple it had no possible deflection. Where is it now? The silence that followed was extraordinary. 10 seconds, 15, 20. The press gallery stopped typing. The cameras did not move. Johnson sat perfectly still with both hands resting on the table in front of him. His mouth opened slightly as if preparing to speak, but no words came. His chief of staff leaned forward and whispered something, but Johnson did not acknowledge it. 30 seconds. His face had gone from composed to visibly flushed. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than it had been all morning. He said the funds were allocated according to national security priorities that required discretionary handling and that full accounting would be inappropriate to disclose in an open session. Crockett asked if he was claiming the money was spent on classified programs. He said he was claiming executive consultation privilege. She asked if executive consultation privilege allowed him to move funds Congress had already allocated without notifying the committees that authorized them. He did not answer. She asked again. He said the question was not relevant to the scope of the hearing. She told him the scope of the hearing was budget reconciliation, and that $1.2 billion in unaccounted transfers seemed highly relevant. Then she told him she was not done. She told him there was someone in the gallery who wanted to speak. A woman in her late 60s stood slowly from the third row. Her name was Margaret Dawson. Her late husband had been a contract engineer for a federally funded port security project in Galveston. The project had been authorized under one of the allocations Johnson had transferred. $218 million for critical infrastructure hardening at Gulf Coast ports vulnerable to both natural disasters and potential security threats. The project had been announced, contractors had been hired, her husband's firm had submitted plans and begun preliminary assessments. Then the funding disappeared, not reduced, not delayed, gone. Moved into a contingency reserve and never seen again. The contractors were told the project scope had changed. No further explanation. Her husband had spent 6 months trying to get answers. He wrote to the Appropriations Committee. He wrote to the Oversight Office. He wrote to the Speaker's office 3 times. He received one response. It thanked him for his inquiry and informed him that appropriations decisions were subject to ongoing review and that updates would be provided as they became available. No updates ever came. He died 8 months ago. Heart attack while working a night shift on a different project in a different state because the Galveston contract he had been promised never materialized. Margaret Dawson was not crying. Her voice was steady. She said she was not asking for money. She was asking where it went. She wanted to know what happened to the $218 million that was supposed to protect the port where her grandchildren still lived. She sat down. The room was silent again. Johnson's hands were no longer resting calmly on the table. They were gripping the edge. His knuckles were white. He started to speak, and his voice cracked on the first word. He cleared his throat and tried again. He said he sympathized with Mrs. Dawson's loss, but that individual contract outcomes were not determined by the Speaker's office, and that funding reallocations were made in consultation with security assessments he was not at liberty to disclose. Crockett asked him which security assessment recommended moving money away from Gulf Coast port infrastructure. He said he could not answer that question in open session. She asked if there was any security assessment at all. He said he had already answered. She told him he had not. She told him she had submitted a classified information request 6 weeks ago, asking for documentation of any national security consultation that justified the transfers. The request had been denied, not on classification grounds. On the grounds that no such documentation existed, she had the denial letter. She held it up. It was signed by the executive branch liaison to congressional oversight. It stated clearly that no security assessment related to the questioned transfers had been requested or received by any intelligence or defense agency. Johnson had moved the money on his own authority, without consultation, without oversight, without review, $1.2 billion. She asked him one final question. She asked him if he had lied under oath when he testified that all allocations had been reviewed and approved through proper channels. He did not answer. 43 seconds of silence. Someone in the back of the room coughed. A staffer's phone vibrated audibly against a table. Johnson's face had gone from flushed to pale. He reached for the microphone in front of him and then pulled his hand back. He looked at his chief of staff. He looked at the ranking member. He looked at the exit. Then he stood. He said he had a floor vote he needed to attend. Crockett reminded him the vote was not for another hour. He said he needed to prepare. He walked toward the door without looking back. His chief of staff scrambled to gather the binders and folders Johnson had brought but had never opened. The microphone on Johnson's lapel was still live. It picked up his voice as he reached the hallway. He was speaking to someone on his phone. The words were faint but audible to the press gallery recording equipment. He said, "We need to get ahead of this." The hearing did not formally adjourn. Johnson simply left. Crockett sat quietly for a moment. Then she closed the binder in front of her and stacked the folders neatly. She thanked Mrs. Dawson for her testimony. She thanked the committee members who had remained. Then she said something that would be clipped and shared across every major news platform by that evening. She said this was not about partisan politics. This was just math. $1.2 billion moved without authorization, without oversight, without accountability. She said the American people deserved to know where their money went. And if the speaker could not answer that question, then perhaps he was not qualified to hold the position. The fallout was immediate. By that evening, 3 separate oversight committees had announced investigations. The House Ethics Committee opened a formal inquiry. 2 Republican members of the Freedom Caucus called for Johnson to recuse himself from budget negotiations, pending the completion of the investigation. Editorial boards from both conservative and liberal outlets published pieces questioning the sustainability of his speakership. But the most damaging coverage came from something far simpler. The video of the 43 seconds of silence. It was shared hundreds of thousands of times, no commentary needed, just a powerful man unable to answer a simple question. Where is the money? The silence said everything. Crockett did not gloat. She did not give interviews claiming victory. She simply released a statement saying that transparency was not a partisan value and that every member of Congress had a constitutional obligation to account for the funds they controlled. She said she looked forward to receiving answers. She said the people of Galveston and every other community that had been promised funding deserved nothing less. Margaret Dawson was not mentioned in most of the coverage, but in Texas, her testimony became the story. Local news stations interviewed her. Community groups organized around her case. The port security project that had been canceled was revived by the state legislature using emergency appropriations. It was not the federal funding that had been promised, but it was something. Crockett attended the groundbreaking. She did not speak. She stood in the back and watched Margaret Dawson cut the ribbon alongside the governor and the mayor. What happened in that hearing room was not theater. It was accountability. Jasmine Crockett had done something that felt rare in modern congressional oversight. She had asked clear questions. She had brought documented evidence. She had given the antagonist every opportunity to explain. And when he could not, she did not need to declare victory. The record spoke for itself. $1.2 billion moved without authorization, hidden in contingency reserves, exposed by a freshman congresswoman who had been dismissed as inexperienced and passionate, but perhaps not quite ready for the complexities of appropriations. Mike Johnson had underestimated her. That was his mistake. She had been waiting for exactly this. She had done the homework. She had compiled the folders. She had found the witnesses. And when the moment came, she had asked the one question that had no good answer. The question he could not deflect. The question he could not spin. Where is the money? He never answered. The silence did.